All right, welcome everybody. We are here to learn about soils. We walk across it every day, but what do we really know about the magic that is underneath our feet? Well, we're going to find out because we have with us three newly minted soil scientists from the University of Maryland with us, and they're also members of they were members of the University of Maryland's soil judging team, which they may talk to you about during the course of the presentation. We have Jonathan Moy with us, Diani Fry, and Mary Gumerov. I apologize for getting names incorrect. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself and turn it over to the experts. Will y'all be covering the difference between soil and dirt?
Yeah, Diani has you covered.
Okay, then I will leave that special reveal to later on. You still have time to write in your chat box what you think the difference between the two are. What is the difference between soil and dirt? All right, thank you so much for coming and sharing your knowledge and your love and your passion for soils with our community of the curious.
All right, let's see. All right, can you guys see the presentation? Nice. All right, good evening, everyone. I hope everyone's having an amazing day. Today we're here to talk about soil, the basis of life on Earth. But first, us three presenters are going to tell you guys a little bit about ourselves. So my name is Jonathan Moy. I graduated this past May from the University of Maryland with a BS in environmental science and a minor in soil science. I competed with the soil judging team for 2 years, and I won't take too much credit for what I haven't done, but with the team last fall, we won the regional competition where the team had all top 3 individuals, and I came in second. And nowadays, I'm a soil conservationist with the NRCS in Dorchester County, Maryland. So I help farmers maintain healthy soils and help them try out new things to increase the longevity of their farms.
Hi guys, my name is Diani Fry, and I also graduated from the University of Maryland in 2019. And now I'm over on the West Coast at Cal Poly, and I'm studying soil science. I was on the team when we took first in nationals at Cal Poly. I also worked for USGS in Patuxent, Maryland, where we studied coastal marsh transgression into upland forests. And I'm really excited to be a soil scientist because I'll get to travel the world and see beautiful soils.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mary Gumerov. I am graduating this semester from the University of Maryland with a degree in agricultural and resource economics and soil science. I'm also an event assistant for the Patapsco Heritage Greenway. My job is to guide volunteers for weekend stream cleanups. And additionally, I'm an Agroecology Lab intern where I study saltwater intrusion on farmlands.
So we started with this question and we're going to get right into it. What is soil? So soil is a natural body, solids, liquids, and gases. A healthy soil, ideal for plant growth, has an equal proportion of air and water, as you can see on the schematic to the right. And it's distinguishable from the parent material, the bedrock, as a result of additions, losses, transfers, and transformations. So that's all just to say that soil is a dynamic system and it responds to changes. Soil is a living body, so it includes the roots, the animals, rocks, artifacts, and it's alive. And if you've ever held healthy soil, you know this. You can feel it, it crumbles in your hand, it smells good. It's so alive, in fact, that in a single tablespoon of soil, there are 50 billion microbes. So in a teaspoon of soil, there's more microbes than there are humans on Earth. So soil and dirt. Some people use the words dirt and soil interchangeably. Those people are typically not soil scientists. And what dirt is basically soil out of place. So it's unconsolidated particles. It's just the mineral component. It's not a living body. So the dirt on the floor in the corner of your house, we typically would not refer to that as soil. Soil is also a non-renewable resource. So it's forming at a slower pace than it's being consumed. 1 inch of topsoil can take hundreds of years to form, and we'll get into why this is so critical a little later on.
All right, so now that we know a little about what soil is, I want to ask you guys, why should we care about soil? I mean, I have my own ideas about why I think soils are awesome, but what about you guys? You can feel free to unmute yourselves or use the chat. Actually, I can't see the chat, but you know what? There we go. Oh, we got one answer. We need it to survive. Life as we know it depends on soil. Nice, I like these answers, so positive. Ooh, gardener, nice. Fun to play with. I like you, Jessica. Nice, nice. We have a lot of really great answers in the chat. Oh wait, oh, there we go. So here's a brief list of what I thought of when I answered the same question. First is the most obvious one. It's one that a lot of you said in the chat. Soil is the food for our food. Whether you eat chicken or you eat bread, many of the original elements in that food, the nitrogen, the sulfur, the iron, it all came from the soil, went to the plant, and then eventually it made its way to you. Not only that, but soil is also a good way to hold things in place. The foundation of your house is built in the soil to hold it in place, much like how roots, like the plant on the right, help hold plants in place. It can also be used to build buildings as an engineering medium. At the bottom of the slide, we see 2 different houses made of mud, the left in Mexico and the right in Nigeria. Now, you might be asking, well, why are these different colors? The answer is that they have different soils, and that's just one example of how soils can teach you about the history of the land. In this case, the geologic history of the land. It can also tell us about the land use history. You know, was it farmed? Was it an old village? You know, things like that. Soil can also act like a filter, so it can take nutrients and other pollutants out of the water so it doesn't pollute our streams and drinking water. And last, and most important of all, I think one of you gave me this answer as well. Soil is so incredibly fun to touch. Anyone who's held a handful of healthy soil can attest that this is true. It's just a different experience.
Great. So another reason we should care about soil is because soil health predicts our longevity as a civilization. There's a great book by David Montgomery called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. And he makes the argument that how people treat their soil can impose a lifespan on civilizations. That doesn't bode very well for us because currently soil erosion is outpacing soil formation and we're running down our stock of fertile topsoil. Now you might be thinking, chill, Diani, chill. Because when you go to the grocery store, you don't have any fears of an impending crisis when you see heaps of produce. And it's true, we've bought ourselves time with the use of genetic breeding and chemical fertilizers. But just because you're not hearing about soil erosion doesn't mean it's not happening. Montgomery calls it the quiet crisis of soil degradation. And even though we don't hear about soil loss on the news, 75 billion tons of soil are eroded every year from arable lands worldwide. That equates to a loss of $400 billion per year. So historically, we've treated soil as an industrial commodity instead of the root of our existence. So some people have called it the most underappreciated but most important resource that we do have. And despite modern farming's ability to support a huge number of people on a smaller plot of land, the fact still remains that you need a certain amount of fertile soil to support each person. So when will we run out of fertile soil? We should probably start implementing smarter land management practices before we reach that point.
Now I just want to share with you a few major soil disasters that we've had in the past 100 years, because You might be thinking, well, if we know all this about it, there's no way that we're still letting it happen, right? So you might have heard about this event in the 1930s. It's called the Dust Bowl. So that was an event where the soil in the Midwest just packed its bags and left. This is a prime example of a worst case scenario of what can happen if we mistreat our soils. The farmers didn't know about many good farming practices back then, so the soil was left unprotected so it could be blown away by the wind and then it gets carried somewhere else. You don't have topsoil in the area that it left, and then you have very nutrient depleted soil that you can't really grow many things in. Also in the 1970s in the African Sahel, which is a little strip of Africa above the Saharan desert, so over there, they experience a cyclical drought every few decades. And in the 1970s, there was a particularly bad drought. And their farming systems didn't have the resiliency to survive these droughts. And ever since, they've had problems with desertification, which is basically the land becoming so dry that you can't really grow plants in it. And to this day, we're still damaging the soils in the Amazon basin. Many people, when they think of the Amazon rainforest, they think of these giant trees and this massive biodiversity that's there. And to feed that, you have to think there has to be exceptionally fertile soil, right? Well, most of the soil fertility that's present in the Amazon basin actually comes from the organic layers on top of the soil. And when you cut away the trees that continually feed those organic layers, what you're left with is a barren, mostly unfarmable plot of land after maybe like 10 years. Now, hopefully you have a better idea about why we are so passionate about soils, but before we can dive deeper into what we can do to improve our soils, we have to go over the basics. So first, we have the 5 soil forming factors, which were first put together by a guy named Hans Jenny in 1941. Basically, he said that these 5 factors control everything about the soil, and this holds true with what we think today. Climate, the temperature and rain patterns in an area are a major factor in this. Rain, as we'll learn later, is particularly important in the weathering of rocks and the transformations that occur in the soil, while temperature can impact how long water stays in the soil and what form the water is in the soil. Organisms also affect things that happen with nutrients in the soil. Disturbance, like when a groundhog digs a hole in the soil, or when a tree falls over and uproots a lot of soil. Organisms can also determine a lot of the chemical processes that happen in a soil and the color of a soil, because more soil organisms usually means a darker soil. Relief or topography plays a major role in things like thickness of the soil. If you look at the picture on the right, you'll see that the sides of hills have a much thinner soil profile than what you would expect at the top or the bottom of the hill. And it can also dictate where the water goes when it rains. Usually it'll go downhill and then it might pond at the bottom. Parent material is what the soil originally came from, and it dictates what elements are in the soil. Is it an iron-rich soil like the Blue Ridge Valley of Western Maryland, or is it a silica-rich quartz like the beaches we have in Maryland? This also accounts for things like glaciers crushing and mixing soil tens of thousands of years ago, like in the upper Midwest, or it could be like the eastern shore of Maryland being underwater a long time ago, where the original sediments are basically what you would expect on the ocean floor. Lastly, there's time. One rainfall won't really do much for soil development, but tens of thousands of rainfalls over tens of thousands of years does a lot for soil development. And Diani is going to talk about the kind of gradient in development later when we talk about the types of soils.
Great. So to manage and effectively protect our soils, we need to know about the properties of these soils. And one very obvious way we can characterize and classify soil is by its color. So in soil science, we use the Munsell color system, and this describes color based on 3 characteristics: hue, value, and chroma. Hue is the basic color of the soil, so it could be red, yellow, orange, and that's the page in the book. Value is on the y-axis, and value refers to the lightness or the darkness of the color. A low value at the bottom here, like you can see on the 2-1 chip, is the darkest color. Chroma is over on the x-axis, And that's the saturation and intensity of a color. So they're more vibrant towards the right. So what does color tell us? It can tell us about the dominant minerals that are present, if and for how long the soil is saturated, and the organic matter content of the soil. So this next slide is just some pictures I have of really cool, beautiful rainbow soils I've seen, and they really do come in all colors. This one on the upper left-hand side is a particularly striking soil that we saw at a road cut in Tennessee. So moving on to soil texture. When we are texturing a soil, we separate the coarse fragment from the coarse fraction from the fine fraction, and we do this by using a sieve. We do that because you can't texture a rock. So once we get the fine fraction, we can do a field determination. And that is, we just use our hands, we wet a soil sample, and we're feeling for how much sand there is. Sand feels gritty, and how much clay there is. And clay is tough, it's hard to work, it's sticky. From that, if you have those two values, you can then infer the silt percentage. So let's say you estimate 43% sand and 18% clay. Can anybody tell me what texture class that would put you in? Again, that's 43% sand, 18% clay. 61%. Silt loam, silty clay. So this is close. It's loam. Yes, we got it. So a loam texture is an ideal plant substrate because it has a good balance of charged particles from the clay, aeration and drainage from the sand, and there's good access to plant nutrients. So we perform texture by feel in the field. And on the left here, you have a sandy loam. You can feel that it's a sandy loam because you can make a ball that doesn't fall apart super easily. On the right, you have a more clayey texture. One way that we determine clay percentage in the field is by how long of a ribbon you can make with the sample before it snaps off. So I have a little question for you guys. Maybe let's, so assuming the same mineralogy and that the soils are uncompacted, what weighs more, a 5-gallon bucket full of sand or a 5-gallon bucket full of clay? So by show of hands, or you can write it in the chat, who thinks that it's sand? Okay, who thinks that it's clay?
Isn't a gallon a unit of weight, or is that just me?
Gallon's the size of the bucket.
Oh,
Mhm.
I actually think it's sand.
You think it's sand,
Yeah.
and you are correct.
I think there's more
So
oxygen in clay.
So I will get into explaining it on the next slide. But this is counterintuitive because you hear, colloquially, if you have garden soils, you describe clayey soils as heavy soils. But let's take a closer look at what's going on. So there's two types of pores in soils. You have micropores. You have macropores, which are the spaces in between the particles, and this is where water can flow. And you have micropores, and these are the pores within the soil particles themselves. So in clayey soils, the pores between particles are very, very small, but they're huge in number. So there's less total pore space in sandy soils than in clayey soils because sand grains are solid and they don't have those micropores within the particles themselves. So I want to take a second to talk about clay a little more in depth because it's really at the center of most of the chemistry that happens in soils. Clay is the smallest particle size and it has a massive, massive surface area. So in a tiny spoonful of soil, you have a football field's worth of surface area, which in my opinion is relatively mind-blowing. And all that surface area means that there's a lot of space for reactions to occur. So soils are negatively charged. Clay is negatively charged. So it holds positively charged cations and nutrients to it. So there are a couple different types of clays that we can classify them into. Can I have the next slide, Jonathan?
All right, sorry.
No worries. So we say high and low activity clays. So these images on the top here are from a scanning electron microscope. On the left-hand side, we have kaolinite. This is a low activity clay. It's a 1-to-1 mineral. You can see this little schematic we have drawn with a rectangle and a trapezoid. That's just how we draw the basic unit of soil, of clay, sorry. So it has one tetrahedral sheet and one octahedral sheet. And if you can see, there's no space between, there's no space between those layers. So you can see in the picture, they're stacked right on top of each other. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, you have a schmectite. This is specifically montmorillonite. And in the scanning electron microscope picture, you can see it's more porous and there's open gaps. And then in the illustration, you can also see that there's a gap in between. We call that an interlayer space. And that's where water can go in. And that allows for these soils to be able to shrink and swell. That's why we call them high activity clays.
All right, and now that we've gone to the finest parts of soil, we're gonna bring it back a little bit, get a little bit bigger. So let's talk about soil fertility. What is soil fertility? It means different things to different people, you know, farmers, soil scientists, people like that. But for me, it just describes a soil where you can have fewer inputs without reducing the outputs. So it'll be the nutrient availability of the soil, the ability for a soil to hold water without it ponding. A good soil will have fewer infestations of pests and diseases. And this all culminates in the soil that's resilient to climate change. It feeds plants without needing as much fertilization. And if you own the land, it gives you a soil that you can pass on for generations. Now let's talk about a few ways that we can get there. So in the NRCS, we have what we call the 4 R's. Not all of these actually start with R, but they all start with right. So we have the right source, at the right rate, at the right time, in the right place. It sounds easy when you put it that way, but you have to remember that all of these nutrients act differently. For example, nitrate, which is a form of nitrogen, is an extremely mobile nutrient, so it can easily go through the soil profile and go into the groundwater, into surface water. While on the other hand, we have something like phosphate, which is a form of phosphorus, which holds really tightly to soil particles. So we may want to supply it in small areas instead of broadcasting it over the whole field. If you look at the chart on the right here, you'll see a graphic showing the availability of different nutrients at different soil acidities. So sometimes the nutrient will be available in the soil, but the plants won't be able to retrieve it from the soil. So if you look at iron, for example, if we have a soil with a pH of 7, might not have very much iron available, but if we have a soil with a pH of like 5.5, the iron will be liberated from the soil particles and then the plants can take it up. However, in all of this, we have to remember that every soil responds differently. What works for John Doe in Salisbury might not work for Jack Kelly over in Hagerstown. But there are still some overarching ideas that can work in most soils. First, let's talk a little bit about the use of pests and fertilizer. Remember when I talked about soil fertility and it's all about reducing your inputs without reducing your outputs? This is what I was talking about. A really nice fertile soil will reduce your reliance on pesticides and fertilizer. That's not to say there isn't a place for pesticides and fertilizer, but maybe it shouldn't be our first option. So what are some of our other options? Let's talk about cover crops. Cover crops are basically a plant that you seed in the fall or winter, so you can have something growing in the soil at all times of the year. This is really good for the soil because you'll always have life and roots in the soil, and this can protect the soil structure and prevent erosion. When we think of rain, we may think of it as a bit annoying or maybe even something fun to play in depending on how you look at it. However, when you look at the soil structure at the surface of a nice soil, a lot of those rain droplets are bigger than the soil structure. And I don't want to sound dramatic, but if I were hit by a rain droplet the size of me, that would probably hurt a lot. And the soil agrees with me. Plant leaves and plant stems are a soil's #1 defense against these water bullets berating them. Number 2 is the roots holding everything together. The roots are constantly transporting nutrients upwards, which means that when you plant the plant next in the soil, you know, your corn or the beans that you plant in the spring, the nutrients will be waiting for you at the top of the soil. Also, since there were fresh roots in the soil, you'll increase soil organic matter, which as a rule of thumb decreases soil compaction because soil organic matter is kind of like a sponge. So it's really light and it kind of wants to expand and have these little pockets of air in it. Cover crops also increase soil microbial diversity through increasing crop diversity, but we'll talk more about that later. Guess what? It's already later. Sorry, bad jokes. Now, Diani said earlier that there are 50 billion microorganisms in a single tablespoon of soil, and all of them have different food preferences. Think about it. I might like tomatoes, but you might like broccoli more than you like tomatoes. Soil microbes are a lot like us in that way. So if you feed the soil a bunch of different plants, you'll have a much more diverse soil microbial community. And this will help your soil become more resilient, and it helps with nutrient availability as well. Now, just like you, me, and the microbes, plants also have their dietary preferences. A crop like corn needs a lot of nitrogen because it's a grass, while soybeans put nitrogen into the soil, but they take up a lot of sulfur. So by changing your crop's needs like this, your soil can replenish its stores of these nutrients over time. So as you're growing soybeans, you're putting nitrogen into the soil for your corn. And then as you're growing corn, maybe you'll get a little more sulfur back, that kind of idea. Last, there's weed suppression. Some plants like rye have this sort of weed suppressive effect where they leave behind chemicals that make it hard for plants to germinate or survive in the early stages of their life. So you'll be able to plant the plants that you want because you'll choose a plant that doesn't react to those chemicals, but you'll be able to get rid of the plants that you don't want. Also, if you plant the same crop year after year, the diseases can start to accumulate in the soil, which can lead to disasters for yields. Diversity helps in this kind of situation because the diseases, if you have corn 4 years in a row, they'll be like, all right, this is the spot where we can get a bunch of corn. But if you have corn once every 10 years, maybe they'll forget that you had corn, so they'll go away. It's that kind of idea. Now let's talk about some of the mechanical things you can do to your soil, since we just talked about some of the biological things we can do with our soil. So the first thing we'll talk about is tillage. It's something we always think of as synonymous with agriculture because it's the standard practice. But let's look at the difference between these two images here. The image on the left is conventional moldboard plow tillage, where the farmer on the right has more directed spot tillage. The farmer on the right has more soil organic matter, which you can tell because the soil is darker, and you can see that there's more residue on the soil, which is good for moisture retention and nutrient retention in the soil. Now, just like with fertilizers and pesticides, don't get me wrong, it has its uses. It makes it a lot easier to seed our plants, but we still have to think, do we really need to turn over all of the topsoil if we're just going to plant in these rows? Who knows? So is anyone here from Western Maryland by chance? Somewhere in the hilly region of the state? All right, so we're all, nice. We have at least one person in Western Maryland, and in Western Maryland, we have a lot more hills than we have in like the Eastern Shore, and even more than we have in the Piedmont, near like Baltimore County, that kind of area. So terracing is a practice where if you'll see it in Maryland, it'll be in Western Maryland. They have a lot more topography or a lot more hills to deal with. Basically, with this practice, you'll take a hilly spot and then you'll break it up into steps. And this will slow down the water and let it infiltrate into the soil. And that'll help you actually also be able to plant crops on the hills. The water won't be rolling so quickly that'll drag the seeds away, drag the plants away. The plants can actually take root. This is instrumental in decreasing soil erosion in hilly areas because it slows down the water. But I told you earlier that all soils react differently, right? Well, let's talk about how we can group soils together so we can start talking about them meaningfully. So let's talk let's talk about why we classify soils. Now look at these two pictures. If you had to describe the colors, you might say, you know, it's pretty dark at the top, and then it gets kind of light, and then it gets dark again. You know, you'd be pretty right with the description of the colors on these pictures, but these are very different soils. The soil on the right is an extremely dry soil. The white layer you see is the accumulation of calcium carbonate, basically the chalk that you use to draw on chalkboards. That only occurs in really dry environments like California, which is where that picture was taken. The picture on the left is next to a field in Maryland. It's so wet there that we have to have a pallet there, and that's the little wood structure you have there, so we can distribute our weight so we don't sink into the extremely wet soil. Now, if I just told you about the colors, I mean, you pretty much describe these the same way, but how do we as soil scientists classify these soils? Well, what if I told you there's more than one soil classification system out there? The one on the far left here is the World Reference Base, which is the soil classification system that the United Nations puts out. It can be used, you know, everywhere in the world, internationally. The one in the middle is the Canadian system of soil classification, which is used in, you guessed it, Canada. The one on the right is the one that's near and dear to Diani, Mary, and my hearts. It's the wonderful, the beautiful soil taxonomy. I know the most about that one, so I'll tell you about its structure instead of the other two. First, at its broadest classification, there's the order. This is the big overarching idea of the soil. Is there, you know, a lot of clay accumulating? Is it a really cold soil? Then it's split into suborders, which are then further split into great groups. And then those are split into subgroups. So there are a lot of levels here. And those are all summarized in this beautiful 350-page book. And you can actually get into even more detail than that in the book Soil Taxonomy, which is around 800 pages. Definitely not a pocket guide. Below that, we also have soil series, which are basically the names for the soils. You know, my name is Jonathan. That soil over there might be sassafras, you know, that kind of deal. Diani is going to help us with some specifics with what's in soil taxonomy.
Yes, so I'm guessing since you guys are in Lepidoptera and herpetology clubs, you might like taxonomy also. Soil classification is really cool. As Jonathan was saying, the most broad way you can classify a soil is by its order. So you pick a soil anywhere in the world and it will fit into one of these 12 categories. I remember learning about this for the first time and I just thought it was so cool. So let's go through it. I'm going to present the orders to you in order from least to most developed. So starting with our entosols, these are our really young, our baby soils. They're recently formed and they haven't yet been influenced by those 5 soil forming factors. An example of these are like sand dunes. Next, we have inceptosols. These are slightly more developed than entosols and they show the inception of a B horizon. Andosols are our volcanic soils. They form out of volcanic ash and have andic properties. They might have volcanic glass in the profile. These soils they're very light, they're fluffy, and they're super fertile because they have a really high nutrient and water holding capacity. Then we have gelisols, and these are our cold soils. It's from the Latin word to freeze. So their soil formation has been stagnated by cold temperatures, and they're defined by a permafrost layer, which is frozen ground that's below 0 degrees Celsius for at least 2 years. They also experience cryoturbation, and this is when horizons mix together via frost and thaw processes. So in Maryland, we have entosols and inceptosols, but no volcanic soils. Next, we have histosols, and we have a lot of these in Maryland along the coast. These are our wetland, bog, marsh soils. They have really high organic concentrations, and they form in anaerobic environments where they're waterlogged. They have a specialized microbe community. And if you've ever been in a coastal marsh, you've probably smelled that rotten egg smell. And that is when a sulfate is being reduced to hydrogen sulfide gas via specific microbes. Next, we have iridosols. We have these a lot in California. These are dry desert soils, and soluble minerals that would have been leached in typically more humid environments persist. So if you were to irrigate the desert, it would actually be really fertile soil. I don't recommend this. It would be incredibly inefficient use of water. But since the minerals persist, it would be good for growing crops. Next, we have vertisols. These are a super cool order. So these are our swelling and cracking soils, and these have those high activity clays that I was talking about that shrink and swell based on the amount of water that's in them. So these form huge surface cracks, and in the structure itself, you can kind of see on the picture, it forms a prism structure that you can actually rip out and have a giant prism. Alpha sols, we have these in Maryland. These are typically formed in humid climates and forested areas, and they have an argillic horizon. An argillic horizon is an accumulation of clay that's been translocated from a higher horizon. Okay, and last but not least, mollisols. These are our super rich, super fertile soils. These are like the ideal farming soil. So they have high organic matter, and we have a lot of these in the Midwest. Grasses have super long roots, and when the grasses die, they put organic matter into the top horizon. Ultisols, we have these in Maryland. These are really highly leached soils that form in humid environments. They also have argillic horizons. Next, there's spotisols. These are acidic, sandy forest soils that have a spotic horizon, which is this dark horizon that you can see under the albic horizon, which is the white horizon. It's pale in color because the mineral coatings have been washed away and accumulated in that spotic horizon. Lastly, we have oxysols, and these are our most weathered, oldest, most developed soils. You see these a lot in tropical and subtropical climates because it's the wet, warm environment expedites the weathering processes. The oxides that are left behind contribute to the red and orange colors, and they're very indistinct horizons. It kind of just looks like one giant horizon.
All right, now this is a map of the different major land resource areas in Maryland, or MLRAs. On the eastern shore and parts of the western shore, we have what we call the coastal plain sediment, which basically means that a long time ago, the area was completely underwater, but as ocean levels dropped, they were exposed to air, and then those marine sediments could go through soil development. More northwest, which is in the orange color, we have the Piedmont, or basically the really old mountains that have weathered down. And these soils are mostly affected.
This is not cold for them. Yeah, but we don't order pizza.
And in the very western part of Maryland, we have more soils that are based off of the bedrock. And these are highly variable because the geology over there is wild. You just can't really expect what rocks you're going to see out there. But what soil orders do we have? Well, here in Maryland, we have predominantly altisols, or those are the old clay soils. But we have a fair mix of entisols and inceptisols, which are the new soils that Diani was talking about. Those are in our beaches and near streams and rivers. In really wet areas, we have histosols. And sometimes in the mountains of Western Maryland, we have alphasols. And in the really sandy bits of the eastern shore, we can have some of those spotisols because we have the really sandy soils over there. But if we zoom out a little bit and then we look at the United States as a whole, we actually have 11 of the 12 soil orders in the United States if you include Alaska. And if you include our territories, we have 12 out of 12 because we have Puerto Rico. And I just wanted to give you just a very small idea about the diversity we have in Maryland soils. So here's a comparison of two Maryland soils. The one on the right here, we have the Elkton soil series, which is a wetland soil in the coastal plain sediment. And this particular pit is near the University of Maryland College Park. The white and other bright colors are because of how wet it is. And on the left, we have the Hagerstown soil series. And this picture was taken near Keedysville. It's really red because it's extremely rich in iron and magnesium because of the way that the rocks weathered.
Whoops. Great. So we've talked a little bit about developed versus young soils. So how exactly does soil weather? So soil weathering is when big rocks break down into smaller rocks and eventually into their mineral constituent components. But let me field a question. Can anybody guess a way that solid bedrock might disintegrate and weather into clay particles that are so small that dozens could fit on the tip of your pencil? You can do chat, or if you want to chime in, that's great too. Okay, someone said freeze thaw. Great guess. Acid. Okay, cool. Microbes. These are great guesses. So we have some, oops. Sorry about that. We have some guesses that are covering physical things and some that are covering chemical things. So basically, when rocks are weathering, they are altering from the bedrock conditions to be more stable at Earth surface conditions. Because Earth surface conditions with variable moisture and pressure and biological activity are super different than what's below the surface. So physical weathering, so physical weathering is the components don't change mineralogically or chemically. They just break down into smaller pieces. So this can happen when there's water in the cracks and it freezes and breaks the rock apart, or saline water. There's also thermal expansion. So say there's a fire and it heats up the very outside of a rock, but the very inside of the rock is still very cool. So that decrease in temperature causes the rock to rupture into sheets on the outside. Chemical weathering is the biggie though. This is how most of our soil has developed. Physical is just kind of a side note. So chemical weathering, the biggest process we see is hydrolysis. So all weathering reactions require water to be driven forward. So hydrolysis is water breaking. So it's when H2O splits into hydrogen and hydroxide, and them splitting breaks the chemical bond in the mineral. Desilication is the loss of silicon, and this is the real key to weathering. So on the next slide, we can see primary minerals have a high concentration of silicon. And as you move to the right, you get less and less silicon. So 2-to-1 means there's twice as much silicon as iron and aluminum. 1-to-1 means there's as much silicon as iron and aluminum. And then when you have iron and aluminum oxides, there's basically no silicon left. So on the next slide, it's just showing the same thing basically. On the left-hand side, we have our young soils. On our right-hand side, we have our old soils. And as you move from left to right, you have an increase of weathering and an increase of desilication.
Alrighty, so now I'm going to talk about this wonderful thing called soil judging. Us three, we've been soil judgers at the University of Maryland, and it's what really helped us fall in love with soil and grow as soil scientists. What is soil judging exactly? It's a collegiate activity where students evaluate soil characteristics and then classify the soil and determine appropriate land uses for a given soil pit. For example, we can determine if the soil is appropriate for building basements, septic tanks, or roads. Here's a picture of some soil judgers in a soil pit. And here you can see Jonathan right in the middle in the soil pit. Here is a list of some basic things needed to soil judge. The very first thing is your scorecard, where you'll be filling out soil related information. I'll show you in the next slide what the scorecard looks like. Then you have your Munsell color book to determine the color of your samples, a muffin tin to collect your soil samples in, a clinometer to determine the slope of the site, a spray bottle to wet your soil samples for texturing, and a bucket to put all of your stuff in, and it serves as a seat. Oh, and of course, your soil knife. This is perhaps the most important thing that you need to collect your samples with. This is an example of a scorecard. Starting from the left, you have your horizon designation, then you have your boundary depth, your texture class, the color that you determine for each horizon, the soil structure, which basically describes how the soil is aggregated together. The moist consistency describes the strength of the sample in your hand. And then you have your redoxomorphic features, which I will get into in a little bit. Then this is the back of the scorecard. So section C asks about the site characteristics, such as landform, parent material, slope. And after you filled out the front of the scorecard and the site characteristics, then you can do the soil classification and determine what kind of soil it is. And after that, then you can do the site interpretations, which is it appropriate for a basement or a septic tank or roads? And it even asks if it's a hydric soil, which is basically asking if it's wetland or not. So I will now briefly just walk you through the soil judging process. Step 1, look around at your surroundings. You want to ask yourself what landform you're on, such as, are you on a floodplain? Are you in a depression? And what kind of vegetation is around? These things give you clues on the soil classification. Here I have pictured of some soil judgers using a clinometer to figure out the slope of the site. Step 2, look in the pit. Soil judgers, they take note of the color changes as you get deeper into the pit, and they use their soil knife to poke around the pit to feel any differences in texture and structure. So just by looking at this picture on the right, we can tell that there are at least 3 horizons. Notice the light color at the top, a different color in the middle, and the darker brown in the bottom. There are probably more horizons, but you would need your soil knife to feel for them. So after you've looked at your pit, the profile, you now are ready to collect your soil samples. Here is a picture of the team collecting soil samples from different horizons into muffin tins using soil knives. And this picture on the right really shows the color differences that you can see from different horizons. And this is all from one profile. So you can see it can get really dark brown or really bright orange. And yeah, so you bring your samples back to your seat or back to the field where you do your analysis. And you do your analysis by determining the color using the Munsell color book, and you texture with your hands, and then you fill out your scorecard. So that's really the only 2 things that you do when you bring your samples back for analysis. Here is just an example of the Munsell color book. You've seen this earlier. And this is an example of a soil with multiple colors. The overall color is grayish, but it has yellowish brown concentrations and lighter gray color depletions, which indicate chemical reactions that occur when the soil gets wet. Soil scientists, they call these redox features. Soil judgers, they take note of all of this in the scorecard. And here are some more examples of redox reactions. The gray sections is where the iron is depleted from the soil, and the iron travels to the bright orange sections, which is why we call them iron concentrations. So after you've done all of that, you are ready to classify your soil and determine its land uses. And here I'm just gonna brag a little bit, but here's a picture of the UMD soil judging team winning the national contest in 2019 in California. And then here is us winning the regionals in 2019. On the right, we have 5 soil judges on the Maryland team, which were ranked in the top 15 of individuals. Unfortunately, soil judging was canceled this year, but I have no doubt that when things are back to normal, we'll continue winning.
Great, thank you. Like Mary said, soil judging is like such an enriching and cool experience that you actually get to be on the ground, touching the soils, interacting with your peers, and we all enjoyed it a lot. So I thought I would take an opportunity to tell you guys a little bit about the research I'm doing for my thesis project. So my project is using portable X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy to predict California soil properties. So allow me to set the stage. I want you all to imagine that you're a lab technician working in a soils lab. Now your job is to put together a comprehensive report about characteristics for samples given to you, finding out things like texture, salinity, carbon, nitrogen. So would you rather spend untold hours performing tedious analyses with specialized equipment, or would you rather use one device to perform a 30-second scan, plug the values from the scan into a model equation, and know all those same properties with reliable accuracy? My project aims to determine if the models can accurately determine these properties for California soils. So what is PXRF, you ask? You can kind of think of it as an X-ray gun because that's pretty much exactly what it is. So the PXRF instrument sends out high energy X-ray beams to the soil sample, which excite the electrons in a certain element. They then fluoresce and return a beam back to the gun with a characteristic wavelength. So we're able to determine the type and quantity of elements present in the sample. This research is really cool and exciting because we have the opportunity to save a bunch of time and money by taking all these specialized equipment, and obviously you need a lab and you need lab technicians, instead using one instrument, model equations, and then getting all those properties. So this is our last point we're going to make, so hang in there. And this is a biggie. So we all know about climate change, and carbon's got a pretty bad rap as the poster child for climate change. But let's break that down a little and talk about how soil comes into play with climate change. So plants photosynthesize. They take carbon from the atmosphere, they put it in the soil. When plants die, microorganisms break down the biomass and respire, putting that carbon back in the atmosphere. The cycle continues. But there are 2 big issues that interfere with this process. The first one is that we're disturbing soils via tilling, plowing, development, and that releases all the stored carbon back up into the atmosphere. And it compromises the ability of the soil to fix carbon in the future because you just destroyed it. The second is that we're pumping astronomical amounts of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere, and that drives the global temperature up. That causes a big problem because the permafrost in those gelosol soils I talked about starts to melt. So all that carbon that's stored in the ice, in the permafrost layer, is released, and now microbes can break it down and release the carbon into the atmosphere. So what do we do about it? So there's a global initiative that was started in France called the 4 per 1,000. And their goal is to increase the amount of carbon that's stored in the soils by 0.4% annually. Since soil is the largest terrestrial store of carbon, a really small change in the carbon sequestration capacity of soils could make a huge difference in the concentrations we see in our atmosphere. Public interest in soils is at an all-time high, which is great. There's even a movie on Netflix called Kiss the Ground, where they talk about soil, which I think is just so cool. So you might be asking, what myself could I do? The first thing is you can start in your own backyard. There's no reason for anyone to be using pesticides or synthetic fertilizers on your own lawn. Instead, use a diverse plant profile that encourages underground and above ground life to flourish. Second, you can support farmers who implement sustainable land management practices. Low input agriculture, organic farming is great. Third, you can go on your rooftop and you can scream about soils. No, I'm just kidding. You can if you want. But if you don't want to do that, you can simply continue to learn more about soils and spread that knowledge around you. Hopefully, if we work together, we treat our land right, we can make it out of this thing alive. So thank you guys so much for your time. We'd love to take questions if there are any. And on the next slide, we have our contact information if you want to reach out and email us, and we'd be happy to talk to you even more. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Do you want to put your can you put your emails in the chat box for people to grab?
Yes, I will do that right now.
Great. And then Jonathan, maybe we can unshare and come back together as a group and see everybody. Wonderful. Thank you so much. In these very challenging times, one of the bright spots and makes me very happy and hopeful is hearing from young scientists. So that's always good. I'll open it up for questions. I'm sure that there's been some questions that I know that they've been being answered along the way. But please go ahead and ask some questions to our panelists.
Hey, Jonathan and Deani and Mary, it's Jordan again. I had a quick question for you guys. First of all, I thought that was really, really great. So nice job. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My question was, in your opinion, what would be the most important management practice to implement in order to maintain good soil fertility in a home garden?
Compost is great.
Composting, okay.
Yeah, that's a great alternative to synthetic fertilizers that you can make from chicken scraps. Kitchen scraps. I feel like like churning your garden soil isn't as big of an issue, but Jonathan, Mary, do you have any thoughts about that?
I know that planting perennials is a big deal because that helps accumulate organic matter over the years. So if you're just planting annuals, you're not letting your soil build up and get stronger over the years. So perhaps that's also another practice that a home gardener could do.
Cool. So good answer. I'm going to pass that along to my parents.
Yeah, I think also just like the idea of keeping roots in there all the time, that's really important. I know, at least when I started gardening, I would pull out the whole plant. But what you can actually do is you can just like snip it at the bottom, cut it up a little bit, and then just leave it there. And then by the time you get there, the next year, maybe it'll be gone, maybe it'll still be there, but it's still good for it. Also, if you have leaves that you rake, instead of throwing it in bags and giving it to someone else, you can just kind of, if you have a lawnmower, you can shred it and then put it into your garden, or even if you don't shred it, putting it into your garden can still be helpful.
Cool. Good ideas. Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Lisa asked about mycorrhizae, or was that Chris? Somebody's asking about mycorrhizae.
Oh, Lisa.
Yeah, that was going to be in our presentation, but we had to cut it. But mycorrhizae is basically, that's another big reason why we don't want tillage, because these intricate networks form, they really work to stabilize the soil and connect nutrients to where they need to go. And when you till, you break all that up. So that's a big thing. There's mycorrhizae everywhere. They're in forest soils, they're in garden soils, they're in your backyard. So those are huge.
Yeah, so they're basically a fungus that has a symbiotic relationship with your plants. So both of them benefit. The the fungus usually gets carbon from the plant, and then the plant gets some like micronutrients from the fungus.
It looks like Jessica has her hand up.
Yeah.
I was just wondering about soil's interaction with water, because I know that there's a lot of runoff that comes from the soil, but I was wondering how you do testing underneath the water, like the soils underneath the water, and how it can affect the water, things like that, and how the water can affect soil, just like the relationships between water and soil.
Yeah, it's actually a really great question. And I'm over here in Dorchester County, which is on the eastern shore of Maryland. And we have a lot of low spots. So there's a lot of interactions between the salt water from the bay and our soils. So that's something that we're actually still struggling with working with. But to answer your question about how we can test the groundwater, a lot of times what we'll do is we'll basically just dig a hole, and then we'll put like a plastic tube with slots in it. And then we'll put that into the hole, which will let water get into the hole without letting the soil get in. And then we'll just take water from that. Or that's my understanding of it, at least.
Yeah, and then with that extract, you can perform analyses and see, is there salts in it? Are there nutrients in it? You know, if you've ever seen the water that comes off of a plowed field versus the water that comes off of a planted field, you know that water plays a huge part in soil erosion. And like I was saying, water plays a huge part in weathering, because you need water to drive all the chemical weathering reactions forward.
Yeah. I was wondering, how do you, like, I understand your water testing in the soil, but how do you get underneath, like, lakes and stuff like that, to get in the soil underneath the water to test that soil?
Okay, so that's actually something where a lot of technology is still being made for that today too. So they have, I think they call it a trident probe, because there are 3 different prongs on it that test different things. And what they'll do is they'll just shove it down to the bottom of the lake, and then they'll open it up so you don't collect the water on the way down. And then they'll pretty much open it up, put it in a little further, and then close it. Then they'll take it out.
That sounds so cool. Can you imagine, like, riding out on a boat just wielding that thing?
That's what they do. They go on boats.
Yeah, but like, you would look so powerful, like riding out on a boat with a giant trident. I think that's so cool.
Warren wanted to know, is there a slide for backyards that Deani talked about? And I'm not sure what they're talking. Warren, you might want to come on and let us know what you were talking about.
We also have someone asking about a different slide about where different soils are from. Do you want me to bring up?
We're going to make this presentation available via YouTube, so that you'll be able to go back and look at all of the slides in detail. With a lot of folks that like to go back and watch the presentations over again, because there's so much information, especially if you're not familiar with the subject matter that's being thrown at you. So it'll allow you to go in and digest it in smaller particle sizes.
Yeah, we need to work with the clay instead of the sand.
Mm-hmm.
If you also want to like email one of us, we could also send you the slides, if that's okay with them.
We do have a question coming up. There's, how do lichens break down rocks? I don't know if you want to mention that, and hopefully if you're signed up for our lichen talk next week on that.
I don't know about that. Do you?
Come back for lichens next week, and you can ask the lichenologist about that.
Yeah, so my understanding is that they attach to the rock with whatever little imperfection there is, and then they'll excrete something that dissolves the rock a little bit, and that can release some particles, and then like over like hundreds or thousands of years, you can get like a small bit of soil there.
Krista says that they produce acids to break up the rock.
Okay.
Jerry wants to know, what do you think is the impact of synthetic particulates on soil and its fertility, like enormous amounts of tire wear particles ending up in the soil?
Well, you got to think that's eventually going to end up in us. There's someone in my lab that's working with, when strawberries are planted, they use these black tarps to tie them down, and then that all goes into the trash, but little parts of it break off and are incorporated into the soil. So they're investigating, can we use biodegradable row covers instead of those plastic things? Things like contaminants in the soil. We have lead in the soil from paints and gasoline when lead was legal. But plastics are a big problem in the ocean. I don't know so much in soils.
They're definitely in the soils, the microplastics. But also a lot of the contaminants we're worried about, the lead, the cadmium that she was talking about, those can actually also compete with some of the nutrients that we need. So I think it was lead that there's research in, where in some areas there's enough lead in the soil that it actually inhibits calcium and magnesium uptake into the plants.
I have a question. I remember you were talking about weathering, and I was wondering how, like, I know how rain can affect soil, but I'm wondering, like, up in the mountains where, like, soil is isn't it a lot more different? And, like, would the snow affect soil in any way? Up in, like, Mount Everest is the first name that comes to mind, but, like, soils up there that are beneath the snow, how do we test that? How do we understand it, and what differences is in it compared to what we have down here?
Well, with true mountains like Mount Everest, there actually isn't going to be much soil there. So if you dig through all the snow, dig through all the ice, it'll just be pretty much rock. But if Mount Everest weathers a little bit like we have in the Appalachian Mountains in Western Maryland, then you can have a wide variety of soils that can form.
And Gina has her hand up over here.
Thank you.
Yeah, I asked earlier about I was the one that asked about the slide. Early in the presentation, there was a really cool slide with like practically a rainbow of different soils on it. But I'm just curious, you know, it didn't get discussed much. So I was dying to know, like, I want to hear about each one. I know we don't have time, but I want to hear about each one of those soils. Like, where did they come from? What makes them all those different colors? You know, would there be a way to, I don't know, find that out later or make that available? That's my question. Thanks.
So if we make these slides available, we actually have even more pictures at the end of just pictures of soil. And I mean, I'm sure if you looked at any 3 of our camera rolls, it's just like soil, soil, soil. But the crazy cool colors you get are just a result of the minerals that are there, the coatings on the minerals. You know, the minerals coatings can be washed to different layers, which forms, you can get like really small little layers, which we call lamellae. And I'm trying to think of other really cool soils I've seen. You get like really gray ones in wetland, and you can color any, like they have these cool tools that you can like scan and it will tell you the color, and you can use that on anything. It's a cool toy.
I have a question. Do you think because Maryland is known as, you know, America in miniature, that you have all these different types of soil across the different geographies of Maryland, that makes the University of Maryland soil judging team so prolific?
That's a really interesting question, but I'd say there's only so much variety you can get in Maryland, because we get pretty consistently like 44 inches of rain throughout most of the state. You know, you get a little bit more on the eastern shore, a little bit less on the western side of Maryland. But that's pretty constant. So there are some things that you can't see, but we do have a really good variety, and that's true. But I think the numbers 1 and 2 for why the University of Maryland soil judging team are so great is because we have amazing professors. Shout out to Dr. Rabenhorst, Dr. Needleman. There's no way we could learn as much about soils without them. And then 2, you know, we kind of treat the soil judging team as a family. So like, it's a lot easier, at least for me, to learn things if I'm having a good time, and then they make it really easy to do that.
Very nice. And Jordan is interested in learning more about Jonathan's job as a soil conservationist, and what are you doing? And you get to get out in the field a lot.
I was gonna type out a response because I don't. It's hard for me to answer that question all in a row. But there's a good amount of field work and a good amount of office work. They happen usually at different times of year. I'd say there's like a 40 to 60 field to office, because there is actually a lot of paperwork we have to do, because like we don't just go out to the field for fun. Usually it's to look at a farmer's property and say, all right, what are some of the conservation practices that we recommend? But a lot of the things that I've been doing recently have actually been a lot more paperwork, because we're doing payments right now for all of those practices. So with the NRCS, what you do is you go to a farmer, you tell them what they can do. The farmer's like, all right, I'm going to do this and this. And then we help them out, so it's easier for them to have good conservation practices. And also there are a lot of opportunities to work with other people, you know, like straight soil scientists, the people who classify soils, and then biologists, geologists. You work with a wide variety of people, which is really cool.
All right, well, this has been a fantastic evening. I look around and everybody looks smarter than they did when we first started, so y'all did a great job. And now your job is to take all of this wonderful knowledge that has been imparted upon you and share it with other folks, because that's what the world needs more of. We need more scientific literacy out there, and you are key to that equation. I hope that you will join us for some of our other programs that are coming up in the future. They're being added every day. I do hope that we get to do some more on soil, because we've just scratched the surface in this fascinating subject matter. And it would be great to go out into the field and do some field work as well with soils too, because it's, as we mentioned before, nothing feels better than getting your hands all in the different soils. So wonderful presentation, great job to Jonathan, Mary, and Diani. And I hope that everybody stays safe, has a wonderful holiday season, and we get to be in person very soon, or virtually even sooner. This program will be made available on our YouTube channel, so I hope that you will subscribe to that. There's a lot of different programming out there, so if there's nothing on Netflix, you can always check us out, because we always have some interesting things going on our YouTube channel like this. So, good evening, take it easy, be safe, and we'll see you soon.
All right, thanks for putting this together and facilitating everything, Bronwyn.
No, thank you, thank you.
It's been a great time.
And feel free to email them. They put their emails up there, so if you have any questions, email them all. And
yeah, I check my email constantly.
We clearly enjoy talking about this kind of thing, so it would be great to hear from you guys if you want.
Yeah.
They should publicize the #1 soil judging team. It's better than any of the sports team that Terps have, right?
Our women's basketball team is actually amazing.
Oh, okay, I didn't know what they were doing this year.
Oh, I don't know about this year, but
Yeah.
you know, when we're actually playing, they're just.
Okay, well, you have the women's basketball, and then you have the soil judging team right below that. Then.
I think we're about tied. I think.
Okay. If anybody's staying on and you want to ask a question or anything, that's fine too. Kind of hang on until everybody makes their way.